Okay, squash and stretch. That's our next topic for discussion. So here we have NURB Sphere. I did a quick set-driven key on this, so when I scale Y down, it scales along Z and X up. You can see here Y's scaling down and X and Z are scaling up. So the sphere is maintaining its volume, and same thing as I scale it up, it's scaling on positive Y, it's scaling Z and X down. So we're trying to maintain volume of the object. If I didn't do that, if we just went ahead and created another polysphere and I scaled it, I'm going to just adjust turn on grid snapping, drop the pivot at the bottom. So if I scale this in Y, you can see it actually looks like it's shrinking, as opposed to grabbing this one in Y, it's maintaining that volume. You can see the difference there, and that helps the audience's perception of these objects being three-dimensional and moving according to the law of physics stay in check, and the audience doesn't get kind of thrown and be like, hey, that object looks like it's shrinking or getting bigger when you're doing your squash and stretch. So that's something important. We really typically don't have to worry about it because whoever does the rigging on our characters usually has that built in. It was a lot different back in the traditional days when everything was hand drawn. That was something they had to be pretty cognizant of as they were drawing characters and such. So another thing about squash and stretch is there isn't that many games that are very cartoony and have a lot of squash and stretch. That's really obvious. Some of the last ones that I can think of, and I'm sure there's been a lot more recently, but like Jak and Daxter was one of the games that I thought handled it really well on Daxter's character. They did a great job with the squash and stretch, and it was very cartoony and fun. But that's the first one that kind of comes to my mind as far as having a lot of squash and stretch. Most games now, there's a lot of mocap, and then if there is keyframing, they're much more realistic or hyper real, and there's not a lot of squash and stretch going on. But that's not to say the concepts aren't used, and we'll go into that a little bit in a bit. Definitely something you want to kind of keep in mind as you're animating your characters. So squash and stretch. One of the important things we want to think of is, I just saved a key here, and I am going to start to squash the sphere down a bit, and I'm going to build some anticipation into a pop up. One thing we want to keep in mind is squash and stretch is typically something that's best felt rather than seen, because if it's really over the top or overdone, you can really start to lose the default shape of your character. And what I mean by that is, if you're squashing and stretching something so much, your character will start to look like it's made out of like a bag of water or Jello, and you lose that material of or the sense of bone and muscle in a character, because even if it's a cartoony character, if it's overdone, it just tends to look really bad. So it's something that you just want to be careful of, and you see it a lot in animators' work that are just kind of starting out and playing with squash and stretch, because it's really fun to do this kind of stuff. Let me save that wide translation there. And I'm going to save it here as well. If we look at this, you can see I'm using the squash here more than I normally would because I'm using it as an anticipation for the ball bouncing up. And then what I would do is I'm going to save another key here. So I'd give it a little bit of hang time up here before it starts to fall. And really you want to use squash and stretch as you want to keep in mind speed, how fast something's going. And a lot of times, you know, back in the day, they developed this to as kind of like a cheap way to do motion blur. Because they weren't rendering stuff with, you know, computers that had motion blur calculated into it. So they were drawing it. A lot of those smear frame stuff, especially like in the Tex Avery cartoons or the you know, Chuck Jones, Bob Clampett, those guys, you know, their stuff was full of it, which was great. So now I'm going to bring this back. One here. And then I'm not going to squash it quite so much now. All right, so let's just play this back real quick. You can see that this squash down to me is way too much. I'm going to soften that. Right now I've got all my keys set to linear. I'm not even going to squash it at this point because it's set that back to 1. It's not really falling fast enough to warrant a stretch. See, it's a much subtler on the bounce down. And this is looking rough because I'm just, you know, really quickly give it a slight little bounce up. I'm animating on 2s. Set that to 1. Actually, this can probably start to go to 1s now. I'm going to cut out that in between. Do that one? Okay. Squash, and then pop up. Oh, and I was going to cut this in between out as well. So, all right, so now we have a very rough blocking of a squash and stretch little hop. Now, if we open our graph editor, we can grab that translation. You can see all my keys are linear. And we can start to smooth out some of these curves. What I'm going to do here is give it, a little bit of an arc. So now, and then same thing over here. This is just happening between one frame, so it really shouldn't matter all that much. So now if we take a look at this, let's check our scale as well. We're going to smooth these guys out. And And let's go back and take a look. Okay, so we want to give it a little bit more hang time up here. And then we want to fix this landing because it's looking pretty cruddy at the moment. But you can see that the squash or the stretch on the way down is not something you really see as you play it. I think this needs to happen a little fast. This part here is a little slow. So we are going to cut out that in between. And we're going to cut out that in between. Okay, so now we're going to switch over to a side view. An orthographic. And I want to give it a little bit more hang time at the top. It's just coming down a little too fast for me. We'll pop open our lovely graph editor. We'll go in here. Actually, what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here and I'm going to add another in-between in there. And that should help that part a little bit. There we go. That's feeling better. Now we just need to fix this bounce at the end and we'll be golden. Kind of looking at the top here. So if we were, one thing I want to do is I just want to check the spacing is. And I'm going to give it a little bit, actually add this in between back in. I'm going to add this in between back in as well. I may give it a little bit more height on this guy here. So let's just grab the graph editor real quick. We're going to grab this guy. And now that we've got these in-betweens back, I'm going to flatten this out. And I am just going to probably increase the height by about half. And then we're going to give it, this time we're going to bounce it again. But this time we're not going to squash it at all. We're going to come here, middle mouse, copy. Maybe just a tad. That's feeling a little bit better now. But we're going to add, we're going to copy this keyframe, and I'm going to save it, and I'm just going to scale it just a touch. And then here on this frame, we're going to have it go back to 1. And then let's give it a little bit of a hold at the end here. And then this final one, we're going to cut out that as well. Cutting out that in between on this last frame. So it gives it that brrr kind of bounce. And then what I want to do too is, because it's kind of bouncing, yeah, it's hitting this wall here at the top, I'm going to soften it a bit by having this pose here favor that extreme. I'm going to kind of do the same thing on the other side of it. There we have it. Okay, so let's just go ahead. This is a little poppy for me right here. So I'm going to go ahead and add another in between just to soften it. Yeah, see that? That's what you needed. And actually, it probably could even use another tiny bounce just to really kind of settle it. And this is even going to be slower, just right off the ground there. Just to get that little high frequency noise, you know, when a ball bounces. There it is. And just to give it a little, see how that just, you know, looks like, you know, a red gym ball or something. It gives you that impression of the material of the object, you know, stretches it. We're squashing it. We're doing it based on speed. We're also using it as part of an anticipation here. You know, so there's a lot you can do with squash and stretch. Again, this is, you know, maybe more of a cartoony example. So let's open up our character, and we're going to talk about, you know, some other ways you can use squash and stretch, or at least the concept of it, in a more typical scenario that you'd find.